Hey guys, tonight we delve deep into the bubbling, mysterious, and occasionally perilous world of forgotten medieval brewing techniques and some truly strange ales. Picture this, you're not in your comfy bed. Not yet. Instead, you're stepping into the flickering firelight of a 12th century brew house. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and a curious sweetness, underscored by something, well, let's just say it's uniquely medieval. Forget your stainless steel and digital thermometers. This is brewing at its most elemental, a craft teetering on the edge of alchemy and, frankly, a good chance of a stomach upset. If you were actually transported back, with your modern sensibilities and delicate digestive system, you probably wouldn't survive this particular historical deep dive for long, at least not without a serious case of medieval malaise. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing just inside the roughly hewn wooden doorway of what can only be described as a medieval brew house, an outbuilding perhaps, or the dedicated back room of a bustling farmhouse. The light is dim, struggling to pierce the smoky haze that hangs in the air, a perpetual twilight world even at midday. What little illumination there is comes from a couple of sputtering tallow candles and the orange, hungry glow of a fire pit in the center of the room, over which a large, blackened cauldron of some sort is suspended. Your eyes slowly adjust, and shapes begin to resolve themselves from the gloom. Massive wooden barrels, their staves bound with what looks like hazel or willow hoops, line one wall, some damp and clearly in use, others looking disconcertingly ancient and fuzzy with, well, you try not to look too closely at the fuzzy bits just yet. The air itself is a tapestry of smells, a far cry from the sterile and controlled environment of a modern brewery. There's the rich, almost cloying sweetness of malted grain, a scent like baking bread mixed with damp soil. Underlying that is the sharp tang of wood smoke, a constant companion in this era, clinging to your clothes and hair almost instantly. But there are other notes too, more subtle, more organic. A hint of something herbal, perhaps from the bunches of dried plants hanging from the low rafters, their identities lost in the shadows, and beneath it all, a damp, earthy aroma, the smell of a packed dirt floor that has seen countless spills, a floor that probably hasn't seen a good scrubbing since, well, ever. Let's just say the 5-second rule for dropped food likely had a much more lenient medieval interpretation here. Perhaps the 5-minute rule, depending on how hungry you were. This place, you realize, is the heart of the alchemical transformation that turns simple grain and water into the lifeblood of medieval society ale. It's less a laboratory and more a rustic kitchen, but the processes unfolding here are steeped in a kind of practical magic, a blend of inherited knowledge, keen observation, and a healthy dose of hope. The brewer, who you might glimpse as a stooped figure stirring the contents of that bubbling cauldron with a long wooden paddle, isn't thinking about yeast strains or a specific gravity. They're working by feel, by smell, by the subtle changes in texture and temperature that only years of experience can teach. Their scientific method might be summed up as, if it didn't make everyone violently ill last batch and tasted somewhat like ale, we're on the right track. And this brings us to the questionable sanitation part of our little excursion. You see, the medieval world didn't quite grasp the concept of germ theory. To them, spoilage and sickness were often the work of mischievous sprites, ill omens, or divine displeasure, not invisible beasties lurking in the water or on improperly cleaned equipment. The wooden mash tuns, fermentation vessels, and even the stirring paddles would have been incredibly difficult to sanitize by modern standards. Scrubbed with sand and water, perhaps, or scalded with boiling water if they were being particularly diligent. But wood is porous. It harbors microbes. It remembers every batch for better or for worse. You might notice the family dog wander in, give a barrel a curious sniff, and then wander out again, adding its own unique microbial signature to the environment. Or perhaps a few chickens are pecking around for stray grains near the doorway. It's all part of the rustic charm and the rustic risk. One of the most significant historical facts about this era is that ale wasn't just a beverage for enjoyment, it was a staple, a source of calories, and often a safer alternative to water. Water sources, particularly in growing towns and villages, were frequently contaminated with all sorts of unpleasantness: animal waste, human waste, runoff from tanneries or other industries. The process of brewing, especially the boiling of the wort, the sweet liquid extracted from the malt, killed off many of the harmful pathogens, making ale a comparatively safer drink. So, while the brewery itself might look like a health inspector's nightmare, the end product, if the brewing gods were smiling, was ironically often better for you than a simple cup of water. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for such widespread ale consumption was its relative safety. Its valuable caloric and nutritional content, it was often called liquid bread, or simply its ability to make the harsh realities of medieval life a little more bearable through its intoxicating effects. Perhaps it was a happy combination of all three. As you observe the brewer at work, you might notice them performing small, seemingly odd rituals. Perhaps they mutter a few words over the mash, or make a specific sign with their hand before adding a new ingredient. This touches upon a quirky little tidbit: brewing was often intertwined with superstition. A failed batch could mean economic hardship, or, at the very least, a very thirsty and unhappy household or village. So, alongside their practical knowledge, many brewers had personal charms, specific prayers or taboo actions they believed would ensure a successful brew and ward off those pesky spoilage sprites. Maybe they wouldn't brew during a certain phase of the moon, or they'd always stir the mash sunwise. These weren't written down in any brewing manual. They were part of the oral tradition, the secret lore of the craft. You can almost imagine a brewer blaming a sour batch on a neighbor giving them the evil eye, rather than the more likely culprit of a rogue wild yeast strain deciding to throw a party in the fermentation barrel. Their definition of clean was also, shall we say, context dependent. If the cat fell into the mash tun, well, you'd fish out the cat, hope for the best, and maybe just not tell anyone. Waste not, want not, especially when it came to potential ale. The tools you see around you are rudimentary but effective for their time. Large, open-topped wooden tuns for mashing the grains, the aforementioned cauldron for boiling, perhaps a few shallower, wider vessels for cooling the wort. Cives made of woven horsehair or straw to separate the sweet liquid from the spent grains. Everything is heavy. Everything is manual. There are no pumps, no automated temperature controls. Just muscle, fire, and an intuitive understanding of the process. Sacks of grain, barley, yes, but as we'll explore later, a surprising variety of other things too, are piled in a drier corner, hopefully safe from rats and moisture, though hopefully is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. This is where your journey into the world of medieval ale begins, in this humble and smoky and slightly precarious alchemist kitchen. The air is thick not just with steam and smoke, but with centuries of tradition, of trial and error, and the ever-present hope for a good, strong pint. The promise of that good, strong pint, or at least a pint, begins, as you might expect, with the grains themselves. Your gaze drifts from the bubbling cauldron towards those sacks piled in that hopefully drier corner of the brewhouse. You're probably picturing mountains of plump, golden barley, the undisputed king of brewing grains, then and now, and you'd be right. To an extent, barley was indeed the preferred grain for medieval ale, and for good reasons. It has a wonderful natural balance of starch, enzymes vital for converting those starches into fermentable sugars, and a husk that acts as a perfect natural filter bed during the brewing process. A brewer's best friend, really. But life in the medieval period was often a masterclass in making do. Failed harvests, wars, droughts, or just plain old regional availability meant that barley wasn't always piled high in every brewhouse. And so you'd find our resourceful medieval brewer turning to a fascinating array of other grains, each bringing its own unique character and challenges to the finished ale. Your eyes might pick out a sack with a slightly different texture, a paler hue to its contents. This could very well be oats, common throughout medieval Europe, especially in cooler, wetter climates where barley might struggle. Oats were a frequent player in the ale-making game. Brewing with oats would often result in a fuller-bodied, sometimes silkier ale, perhaps with a characteristic haziness that was perfectly acceptable, even expected. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a hazy IPA, only without the hops and probably with a few more bits floating in it. The enzymes in oats are a bit different, a bit less enthusiastic than barley's, so the brewer might have had to adjust their mashing temperatures or times, coaxing those sugars out with a little more patience. And next to the oats, perhaps another sack contains wheat. Wheat, often prized for bread making, sometimes found its way into the mash tun too. Using wheat could lend a certain lightness, a subtle tartness, and contribute to a lovely, frothy head on the ale, something even a medieval drinker could appreciate. However, wheat could be a bit of a diva. It lacks a husk, which meant the brewer might face a frustratingly sticky, stuck mash, like trying to strain porridge through a colander that's seen better days. Sometimes, the use of wheat in brewing was even restricted by local lords or guilds to ensure enough was available for bread. The literal staff of life. Imagine getting fined because your ale was too wheaty and the village ran out of bread. A PR nightmare for any brewer. Then there's rye, another hearty cereal that could thrive where other grains faltered. If you were to peer into a sack of rye, you'd see grains that are longer, more slender than barley, often with a grayish-green tint. Ale brewed with rye would have had a distinctively spicy, almost peppery character, a certain earthy robustness, but rye, much like wheat, could be tricky. It's high in beta-glucans, which are complex sugars that can create a very viscous, almost gluey consistency in the mash. Our medieval brewer would need all their strength and a sturdy paddle to get through a rye-heavy brew day, probably muttering a few of those brewing charms we talked about under their breath for good measure. The resulting ale, though, could be wonderfully warming, a real winter treat. Beyond these more common alternatives, the medieval brewer's grain bill could get even more creative, especially when times were tough. Historians still argue whether the inclusion of certain adjunct grains was purely out of necessity, or if some were prized for specific qualities they imparted to regional ale styles even when barley was available. You might find evidence of spelt, an ancient cousin of wheat, being used, or even millet in some regions, though that was less common in Western European brewing circles. These were grains of resilience, used by people who understood their local environment and knew how to get the most out of it. And then you have the truly desperate grains, as you might call them. When famine stalked the land, or during a prolonged siege, the definition of brewable ingredients became astonishingly flexible. Accounts, though sometimes vague, suggest that in dire straits, people turned to legumes, dried peas, beans, lentils, to create something, anything, that could be fermented. You can just imagine the taste of a pea-based ale. It probably had a certain earthy profile. Shall we say perhaps peculiar is the word we're looking for. Nutrition was paramount, and if it fermented and provided calories, taste was a secondary, perhaps even tertiary concern. There's a quirky, though less appetizing, tidbit here. Some of these ales made from non-traditional ingredients, especially in extreme scarcity, might have been closer to thin, fermented porridges or gruels rather than what we'd recognize as ale. They would have been low in alcohol, cloudy, and likely quite sour, but still, a source of hydration and meager sustenance. You might even find references to people soaking stale bread in water and allowing it to ferment, a practice reminiscent of Eastern European kvass. The impact of these various grains on the final product was, of course, immense. They influenced the color, from the pale gold of a light wheat ale to the darker hues of an oat or rye-heavy brew. They dramatically affected the mouthfeel, the silkiness of oats, the potential thinness from some desperate adjuncts. Flavors could range from the clean sweetness of barley malt to the spicy kick of rye or the vegetative notes of a brew stretched with broad beans. Alcohol content would vary wildly too, depending on the sugar content of the grains and the success of the fermentation. Our medieval brewer wasn't just throwing things into a pot, they were adapting their ancient craft, their inherited knowledge of temperatures, quantities, and timings to wrestle a drinkable brew from whatever raw materials were at hand. It's a testament to human ingenuity, and perhaps the surprising resilience of the medieval palate. One can only imagine their brewing notes, day 60 of the barley famine. Attempted malting acorns, results, crunchy, and very, very bitter. The squirrels are starting to look at me funny. A mainstream historical fact that underscores the importance of these base ingredients is the existence of regulations like the assize of bread and ale, first enacted in England in the 13th century. This law aimed to control the price and quality of these two absolute staples of medieval life. The price of ale was often directly linked to the price of grain, barley, wheat, and oats specifically. If grain prices went up, the price of ale could rise, or more often, the strength or quantity would decrease. This shows just how central these grains were, not just to the brewer's craft, but to the entire economy and the daily lives of ordinary people. Access to grain meant access to bread and ale. It meant sustenance and a small comfort in a harsh world. So, as you look at those humble sacks, remember they represent far more than just raw ingredients. They are the very foundation of medieval liquid sustenance, in all its varied and sometimes desperate forms. Now, that foundation of grains, varied and desperate as it sometimes was, needs a partner to begin its magical transformation into ale. And that partner, making up the vast majority of your pint, is water, an element so seemingly simple, yet in the medieval world, so profoundly complex and often treacherous. You watch as the brewer, or perhaps a weary-looking assistant, hauls buckets of water towards the cauldron. The source of this water is as critical to the final brew as the quality of the malt. Perhaps even more so. After all, ale is mostly water, and if your water isn't right, well, your ale is going to have an uphill battle. Finding good water in medieval times wasn't as straightforward as turning on a tap. You couldn't just whip out a water quality report or check for E. coli levels. Brewers, and indeed, everyone relied on more, shall we say, elemental methods of assessment. Does it look clear? Does it smell sweet? Or does it carry the whiff of the nearby dyer's workshop, or the less than fragrant open sewer that might run through the center of town? Their idea of water testing was probably something along the lines of, did old man Fitzwilliam drink from this stream an hour ago? And is he currently upright and not an alarming shade of green? A low bar, perhaps, but a practical one. The most common source, especially in rural areas or smaller settlements, would be a nearby river or stream. You can picture it now, a picturesque babbling brook. Sounds idyllic, doesn't it? Except that same babbling brook might also be the dumping ground for all manner of village waste. Animal runoff, laundry water. The charming byproducts of the local tannery. If your water tasted suspiciously like their latest batch of discount leather, you knew your ale was in for a challenging, and likely very leathery, start. In larger towns, rivers were even more problematic, often acting as the main arteries for both water supply and waste disposal. A delightful combination. Wells offered a potentially better, though not guaranteed, alternative. A well dug deep enough and situated thoughtfully uphill from obvious contaminants like the village latrine pit or the graveyard. Yes, these things mattered. Could provide clearer, cleaner water. Monasteries, often the champions of medieval brewing, frequently had their own private, well-maintained wells or springs, which undoubtedly contributed to the renowned quality of their ales. Public wells in towns were vital, but could be overcrowded, overused, and still susceptible to contamination seeping through the soil. You'd see people lowering wooden buckets, hoping for the best, trying to skim off any floating debris before hauling their precious and possibly pathogen-laden cargo home or to the brewhouse. The most prized water source was often a natural spring. Spring water, filtered by layers of rock and earth, was generally the purest available. Some springs even gained reputations, perhaps associated with a local saint or a bit of folklore, for their life-giving or ale-improving properties. You can imagine a brewer making a special trip, further afield, to collect water from a revered spring, believing it held a secret magic that would bless their brew. Rainwater collection, using cisterns or barrels, was another option, providing soft water that might have been beneficial for certain brew styles, though its reliability for the large quantities needed for consistent brewing could be an issue. Now, medieval brewers didn't understand water chemistry. The complex interplay of minerals like calcium, magnesium, sulfates, and carbonates that modern brewers obsess over. They didn't know that certain minerals could enhance flavor, aid yeast health, or affect pH. But they did observe. They knew, through generations of trial and error, that water from a particular well made a better dark ale, while water from another stream seemed to suit a lighter brew. They were unwittingly experiencing the effects of what we now call water profiles. The famous ales of Burton-on-Trent in England, for example, owed their later renown to the town's gypsum-rich water. Perfect for brewing those crisp, pale ales, medieval brewers in areas with similar water might have found their ales had a certain pleasing bitterness or clarity, without ever knowing the geological reasons why. They just knew that good brewing water came from that source, not the other one. Historians still argue whether the consistent quality of ale from certain monastic breweries, for instance, was primarily due to their better access to and protection of water sources, their meticulous for the time cleaning practices, or perhaps even their more consistent grain supplies and malting techniques. It was likely a delicate dance of all these factors. Crucially, the brewing process itself offered a significant, albeit accidental, purification step. Remember that bubbling cauldron over the fire. The wort, that sweet, sugary liquid made from steeped grains and water, was boiled for a considerable time. This boiling, essential for extracting flavors, concentrating sugars, and originally for sterilizing additions like gruit herbs, had the incredibly important side effect of killing most waterborne pathogens. This is a key historical fact. While the water going into the brew might have been teeming with invisible nasties, the ale coming out was often far safer to drink than the original water source. This is one of the primary reasons ale became such a staple beverage. It wasn't just about the buzz, it was about survival in a world where a simple drink of water could lay you low for weeks. Of course, this accidental sanitation wasn't foolproof. If the post-boil cooling process was too slow, or if the fermentation vessels weren't clean, and remember our earlier discussion about wooden tuns, then new contaminants could be introduced. But the boil itself was a lifesaver, quite literally. Efforts to secure good water were not insignificant. Medieval towns and monasteries sometimes invested heavily in impressive engineering projects to bring cleaner water into their communities. Conduits, often made of lead or hollowed-out logs, were constructed to channel water from distant, purer springs or rivers, bypassing closer, more polluted sources. London's Great Conduit, built in the 13th century, is a famous example, piping spring water into the city for public use. Access to such improved water sources would have been a boon for brewers aiming for quality and consistency. Yet, even with these efforts, a quirky tidbit persists in the imagination. The idea that some brewers might have relied on less than scientific methods to ensure their water was up to snuff. Beyond basic observation, did some employ dowsers to find the best underground streams? Did they have rituals for drawing water? Specific incantations whispered over the wellhead? or lucky buckets. Perhaps they swore by water collected only during a waxing moon, believing it imbued the liquid with extra vigor for fermentation. Or maybe, just maybe, they simply used the well that was furthest from the pigsty and the graveyard, which, while sounding less mystical, probably had a far greater impact on the final quality of their ale. It's a charming thought, this blend of practical observation and lingering superstition, all in pursuit of that perfect, life-sustaining brew. The water, as it seems, held as many secrets and potential pitfalls as the grains themselves. And just when you thought the grain and water had revealed all their medieval secrets, you notice our brewer reaching for another key set of ingredients, ones that will define the very soul of the ale before a single hop cone ever graced a brew kettle in many parts of the world. Your eyes follow their hand as it moves towards those bundles of dried plants you saw earlier, hanging like forgotten decorations from the smoky rafters, or perhaps towards a carefully guarded wooden chest in the corner. This, my friend, is where we delve into the truly mysterious world of Groot. Before hops became the dominant force in bittering and preserving beer, a complex, aromatic, and sometimes potent blend of herbs and spices known as Groot, or Grut, or Grite, depending on the local dialect, was king. Imagine a time when ale wasn't just bittered, but imbued with a whole spectrum of flavors and aromas, from earthy and resinous to floral and spicy, all derived from the local flora and the closely guarded recipes of the brewer or the grutier. The exact composition of these Groot mixtures is often a tantalizing puzzle for historians and brewing archaeologists. Recipes were frequently kept secret, passed down orally, or controlled by powerful entities. It's like trying to reconstruct a lost art form where only whispers and fragrant shadows remain. What went into these mysterious concoctions? While regional variations were vast, a few key players appear repeatedly in the historical record. One of the most prominent was bog myrtle, also known as sweet gale. Picture yourself crushing its leaves. A wonderfully resinous, slightly astringent, and aromatic scent would fill the air. It was a primary bittering agent, but also known for its, let's call them enlivening properties. Some accounts suggest it could lead to more intense intoxication, or even rather vivid dreams. So, your pint of Groot Ale might have come with more than just a boozy warmth. It might have been a ticket to a slightly altered reality. You'd order an ale, and depending on the Groot of the day, it might come with a side of existential ponderings or an inexplicable urge to compose a sonnet to the barmaid. Standard Tuesday night, really. Another common ingredient was yarrow, a feathery-leafed plant with clusters of white or pale pink flowers. Yarrow, like bog myrtle, contributed bitterness and aroma, and it too had a long history in folk medicine, believed to have all sorts of beneficial properties. Then there was wild rosemary, or, more intriguingly, Labrador tea, though one had to be careful with the latter, as some varieties possess compounds that are decidedly not good for you in larger quantities. Adding a frisson of actual danger to your ancient tipple, these would have added piney, resinous, and sometimes floral notes to the brew. But the list didn't stop there. Depending on the region and the brewer's fancy, Gruit could include heather flowers, lending a delicate honeyed aroma, juniper berries for a gin-like sharpness, mugwort, an herb often associated with dreams and divination in folklore, horehound for a unique bitterness, ground ivy for its minty, earthy notes, or even dandelion. Some brewers might have experimented with tree barks, various seeds, or resins, each adding their signature to the final product. It was a veritable witch's garden of brewing botanicals. The purpose of Groot was threefold. Firstly, and most obviously, it was for flavor and aroma, providing a necessary counterpoint to the inherent sweetness of the malt. Without some form of bittering agent, ale can be rather cloying. Secondly, some Groot herbs possessed mild preservative qualities. While nowhere near as effective as hops in this regard, certain botanicals could help stave off spoilage for a short time, extending the ale's drinkable life just a little. Thirdly, and perhaps most fascinatingly for our journey into strange ales, were the potential intoxicating, medicinal, or even psychoactive effects of these herbal blends. Many of these plants were mainstays in the local apothecary's chest, used to treat ailments, soothe nerves, or even, in some traditions, to achieve altered states of consciousness. It's not too much of a stretch to imagine that some Groot ales were known and sought after specifically for these added dimensions. That ale from the little brewery by the misty fen, maybe it was famed for inspiring particularly creative storytelling, or for making you feel like you could understand the whispers of the wind. This brings us to a crucial mainstream historical fact about Groot the Grootrecht, or Groot Rite, in many parts of medieval Europe, particularly within the Holy Roman Empire, the Netherlands, and parts of what is now Germany and Belgium. The right to produce and sell Groot was a strictly controlled and highly lucrative monopoly. This right was often held by the church. Monasteries and bishoprics grew wealthy from it, or by local nobles or designated families. Brewers were often legally obliged to purchase their Groot from the official holder of the Grootrecht, who would have their own secret. Standardized recipe for the region. This not only generated substantial revenue for the authorities, but also gave them a measure of control over brewing itself. Breaking the Grootrecht could lead to hefty fines or worse. Imagine trying to get that official Groot recipe from a medieval Groot master. It'd be like requesting the formula for Coca-Cola, only the negotiations might involve more stern-faced monks and fewer corporate lawyers. Because of these monopolies and the secrecy surrounding the recipes, the actual blending of Groot was often done in dedicated Groot houses. This leads to a quirky tidbit. These Gruit houses were sometimes shrouded in an almost mystical aura. The specific blends were trade secrets of the highest order, and rumors might circulate about the extraordinary properties of certain Groots. Perhaps one blend was whispered to be an aphrodisiac, another to bring good fortune, or a third to lend warriors unconquerable courage, or at least make them think they were unconquerable. Which is half the battle. The Gruitier, the official maker and seller of Groot, was a person of some standing, a purveyor of not just herbs, but of flavor, tradition, and perhaps a touch of magic. The brewer, having acquired their Groot legally, or perhaps through some clandestine back-alley herb dealer, would then have the task of incorporating it into the ale. Usually, the herbs were added to the wort during the boil, much like hops are today, allowing their resins and essential oils to dissolve and infuse the liquid. The skill lay in achieving the right balance, as many of these herbs could be overpowering or unpleasantly bitter if used too heavy-handedly. The eventual decline of Groot and the rise of hopped beer is a complex story. Historians still argue whether the triumph of hops was primarily due to their demonstrably superior preservative qualities, allowing beer to be stored longer and transported further. Economic pressures aimed at breaking the profitable Groot monopolies, a gradual shift in consumer taste towards the clean bitterness of hops, or even subtle religious or political undercurrents, with hops sometimes being favored in certain Protestant regions. Whatever the combination of reasons, by the late medieval period and into the Renaissance, hops were steadily marching across Europe, pushing the ancient tradition of Groot into the shadowy corners of brewing history, making these uniquely flavored ales truly forgotten for a long time. But for centuries, Gruit was the soul of the brew, the secret whisper in your medieval pint. That secret whisper of Groot, potent and mysterious as it was, needed a robust voice to carry it, the voice of the malt itself. And creating that voice, transforming humble raw grain into something the yeast could truly sing with, was an art form all its own, a laborious, hands-on dance called floor malting. Before any mashing or boiling could occur, before those Groot herbs even thought about joining the party, the grain had to be coaxed into a state of readiness. You see, raw grain is mostly starch, locked away in a form that yeast, our tiny alcoholic allies, can't readily consume. Malting is the ingenious process of tricking the grain into thinking it's time to grow. Starting the process of converting those complex starches into simpler and fermentable sugars by activating its natural enzymes. It's like waking up a sleepy giant within each kernel. Your journey now takes you to the malt house, which might be a dedicated building, cool and dim, or perhaps a section of the brew house itself. specifically designed for this crucial first step. The air here smells different, less of smoke and boiling wort, more of damp earth, wet stone, and the uniquely fresh, almost cucumber-like aroma of germinating grain. The first stage you witness is steeping. Large sacks of barley, or perhaps oats or wheat, as we've discussed, are being heaved by strong arms into a steep tank, a large wooden or stone vessel filled with water. Here, the grains will soak for a day or two, drinking their fill, swelling visibly, their moisture content rising significantly. The water would be changed periodically, not just for cleanliness, but also to remove any undesirable substances that might leach out. The brewer or maltster, for this was often a specialized skill, would be observing carefully, feeling the grain, knowing by instinct and experience when it had absorbed just the right amount of water to awaken from its slumber. Once thoroughly steeped, the wet grain is transferred, heavy and dripping, to the malting floor. This is where the germination games truly begin. The grain is first piled into a thick heap called a couch. This helps to build up a bit of warmth, encouraging the kernels to kickstart their growth uniformly. After a day or so, the couch is broken down, and the grain is spread across the floor in a thinner layer, perhaps only a few inches deep. The floor itself is key, usually made of stone, tile, or even hard-packed earth. It needs to be cool and retain some moisture to encourage the gentle, controlled germination that the maltster is looking for. Now, you see the real labor? For the next several days, typically anywhere from 3 to 7, depending on the grain, the temperature, and the maltster's desired outcome. This bed of grain must be turned regularly, meticulously. You'd see the maltster, or their apprentices, armed with wide wooden shovels or rakes, rhythmically turning, shifting, and aerating the grain. This wasn't just for show. Turning prevented the tiny rootlets, which begin to sprout from the kernels, from tangling together into an unmanageable mat. More importantly, it helped to control the temperature. Germination produces heat, and if the grain bed got too warm, the growing process could race out of control, or worse, unwanted molds could take hold. Too cool, and the process would stall. Turning released excess heat and moisture, ensuring a more even germination throughout the entire batch. It was the medieval equivalent of a full-body, low-impact workout, repeated several times a day. Your reward wasn't a fancy gym membership, but the promise of good ale. Fair trade, I'd say. They didn't have digital thermometers or sophisticated climate control systems back then. The maltster relied on their senses, the feel of the grain in their hand, its temperature against their cheek, the subtle changes in its smell, the way it resisted the shovel. They were intimately connected to the process, a living thermostat and humidity gauge. They would look for the telltale signs of acrospire growth, the nascent shoot that grows beneath the husk of the grain. The ideal was for this acrospire to grow to about 3/4 or the full length of the kernel. If it grew out of the end, valuable sugars and enzymes were being wasted on actually trying to grow a plant, which was not the goal here. We're trying to make ale, not start a tiny, confused indoor farm. Oh dear, the maltster might sigh. Looks like young Timothy let the acrospires escape again. That's his ale ration docked for a week. Challenges were ever present. A sudden warm spell could send temperatures soaring in the malt house. A cold snap could halt germination in its tracks. Pests, rodents, and insects were always eager to sample the nutritious grain. And mold, the bane of any maltster, was a constant threat in the damp conditions. It required vigilance, experience, and perhaps a few of those muttered charms we've encountered before to bring a batch of malt successfully through the floor. Once the maltster judged that the modification of the grain was complete, that the starches were sufficiently broken down and the enzymes fully developed, the germination process needed to be halted. This was achieved through kilning. The now green malt so-called because it's freshly sprouted, not because it's green in color would be carefully moved to a kiln. Early kilns were rudimentary, often just a perforated floor above a gentle fire, fueled by wood, straw, or later coke. The heat would dry the malt, stopping the germination and reducing its moisture content for storage. The temperature and duration of kilning also had a profound effect on the malt's character, creating anything from very pale malts dried gently with air or minimal heat to darker, more flavorful amber or brown malts if the heat was higher or applied for longer. Historians still argue about the extent to which medieval maltsters could precisely control this kilning process to achieve specific malt flavor profiles, or if much of the variation we see in old recipes was wonderfully accidental, a result of the somewhat unpredictable nature of their early kilns. A significant historical fact is that malted grain wasn't always produced by the brewer themselves, especially in larger towns and cities. Malting became a specialized trade. Professional maltsters would produce large quantities of malt and sell it to brewers, taverns, and even individual households that brewed their own small ale. Malt was a valuable commodity, bought and sold, and its quality could make or break a brewer's reputation. And for a quirky tidbit, while we can't definitively say medieval maltsters sang lullabies to their germinating barley, they certainly developed an incredibly intimate understanding of their craft. Some old hands likely claim they could tell the mood of the grain, or that it responded to their particular touch, or even the time of day they turned it. It's easy to imagine a grizzled old maltster, whose family had been in the trade for generations, scoffing at a newcomer's attempts, declaring, "The grain doesn't like the way you're looking at it, lad. You need more respect." It's this blend of backbreaking labor and profound, intuitive skill that characterized the ancient art of coaxing life, and ultimately ale, from a simple pile of grain on a stone floor, with that malt now expertly coaxed through its germination games and gently kilned to perfection, or at least to a state the maltster optimistically declared good enough. Its sugars are primed and ready, but they're still locked inside the glassy kernels, a hidden treasure waiting to be released. The next act in our brewing drama is to liberate them, a sticky, steamy, and sometimes rather risky performance known as mashing in. This is where our medieval brewer, armed with more hope than precision instruments, attempts to coax those precious starches into sweet, fermentable sugars. First, that carefully prepared malt needs to be crushed. You wouldn't want to throw whole kernels into water. That would be like trying to make tea without taking the leaves out of a sealed tin. The grain needs to be broken open, exposing its starchy endosperm, but not ground into fine flour, which would create a nightmarish, gluey mess later on. You'd see the malt being laboriously milled, perhaps using a small stone quern, a hand-cranked device similar to those used for grinding flour, or even more primitively, with large wooden pestles and mortars. It's another physically demanding task, filling the air with fine malt dust that gets into your nose and throat, a sweet, slightly toasty aroma mingling with the ever-present wood smoke. Once the grist, that's our freshly crushed malt, is ready, it's time to introduce it to hot water. This all happens in the mash tun, a large wooden tub that you've probably noticed lurking in the brewhouse. It might have a rudimentary false bottom, perhaps made of woven willow twigs, straw, or even a layer of larger stones, designed to help separate the sweet liquid from the spent grains later on. But how, you might wonder, do you get the water in this wooden vessel to the precise temperatures needed for the enzymes to do their work? Especially if you don't have a giant metal kettle or an easy way to heat large volumes of water directly in wood without, setting it all on fire. This is where one of the most fascinating and frankly, slightly terrifying medieval techniques comes into play heating with hot rocks. Imagine our brewer, or a very brave assistant, tending a roaring fire nearby. In this fire, carefully selected stones, not just any old pebbles, mind you, as some types can shatter or even explode when heated, are being brought to a searing, incandescent glow. These fiery projectiles are then carefully, and one hopes with a great deal of practice and asbestos-like hands, plucked from the flames using crude tongs or shovels and plunged, hissing and steaming dramatically, into the water already in the mash tun. The sound is incredible, a violent sizzle, a rush of steam that momentarily obscures everything, and the deep rumble as the rocks settle. It's a real spectacle, part industry, part primal ritual. Temperature control with this method was, shall we say, an art rather than a science. Too few rocks, or rocks not hot enough, and your mash would be a lukewarm, enzymatic slacker party, resulting in poor sugar conversion. Too many, or too hot, and you risk denaturing those precious enzymes with excessive heat, effectively killing their ability to convert starch. You might also inadvertently superheat pockets of the mash, scorching the grain and lending a less than desirable eau de bonfire to your final ale. Precision engineering. It was not. Of course, if the brewhouse was fortunate enough to possess a large metal cauldron, like the one we saw earlier, they could heat water in that and then transfer it to the mash tun, mixing it with the grist to achieve the desired consistency and, hopefully, temperature. This was certainly a more controlled method, but the hot rock technique persisted for a long time, especially in more rustic settings or for smaller batches. Some even believed the hot rocks imparted a unique, slightly caramelized or smoky character to the wort, a desirable flavor. Imagine explaining to a modern, data-obsessed craft brewer that your primary heating element was a pile of carefully curated igneous rock. They'd probably offer you a comforting pat on the back, a therapy session, and a digital thermometer, possibly in that order. Once the hot water and grist are combined, the mash begins. It's a thick, say, porridge-like mixture, and the brewer stirs it vigorously with a large wooden paddle or rake to ensure even hydration and temperature distribution. Then comes the waiting. The mash is left to rest, typically for an hour or more, allowing those enzymes, woken during malting and now happily swimming in warm water, to get to work, snipping away at the starch molecules and turning them into wonderful, sweet sugars like maltose. The medieval brewer wouldn't be timing this with a stopwatch. They'd be watching, perhaps smelling for the characteristic sweet aroma to develop, or maybe just judging it by the length of time it took for the chickens to lay their morning eggs. How did they know if the mash was proceeding correctly without a pH meter or an iodine test to check for starch conversion? Again, it was down to experience, observation, and a good dose of that medieval hope. They might taste a little of the liquid as it rested. Is it becoming noticeably sweeter? Does it look right? Perhaps the most advanced diagnostic tool was the stick a finger in it and hope for the best method. If you could still feel your finger after a few seconds, it might not be hot enough. If you let out a yelp and instinctively started inventing a new medieval dance craze, it was probably just right. Or a tad too enthusiastic. Either way, you had data. The ultimate goal of mashing is to produce a sweet, sugary liquid called wort. After the rest, the brewer would begin the process of draining this wort from the mash tun, a step called lautering, which we'll explore more later. But the success of that lautering, and indeed the entire brew, hinged on the success of this mashing in stage. A key historical fact here is that medieval brewers, in their quest for efficiency and to cater to different needs, often practiced what we now call party-gyle brewing. They would drain off the first, most concentrated wort from the mash. This rich, sugary liquid would be used to make their best, strongest ale, the premium stuff, reserved for special occasions or for those who could afford it. Then they wouldn't just discard the remaining grains. Oh no, waste not, want not. They would add more hot water to the already mashed grains, a process called sparging, to rinse out any remaining sugars. This second, weaker wort would be used to brew a small beer or table beer, a less alcoholic, everyday drink that was safer than water and consumed by the whole family, including children. It was an ingenious way to get the most out of their precious, laboriously produced malt. For a quirky tidbit, it's easy to imagine brewers developing personal rituals or superstitions around the mashing process. Perhaps a lucky stirring paddle, passed down through generations, was believed to ensure a good conversion. Or maybe they had a specific chant or a quiet prayer they'd utter as the hot rocks went into the tun. A little divine insurance policy against a stuck mash or denatured enzymes. Some might have even sworn by using a particular type of wood to heat their rocks. convinced it lent a superior, subtle smokiness that was their brewery's signature. Given the inherent variability of these methods, historians still argue about the typical efficiency of medieval mashing. How much of the potential sugar in the malt were they actually able to extract compared to the highly optimized, temperature-controlled processes of modern brewing? It was almost certainly lower, but clearly effective enough to produce countless gallons of ale that fueled kingdoms and quenched the thirst of generations. Their methods might seem primitive, even a bit haphazard to us, but they were born of centuries of tradition and a deep, intuitive understanding of the natural magic at play. That sweet, precious wort, wrested from the grain with such effort and a fair bit of hope, is still just that, sweet. It hasn't yet earned the noble title of ale. For that transformation, our medieval brewer must now surrender their creation to the invisible, unpredictable, and utterly magical forces of fermentation, a true gamble played out in the depths of ancient wooden vats. You watch as the now cooled sugary liquid is transferred, perhaps by bucket brigade or through wooden troughs, into the fermentation vessels. This is where the real alchemy happens, where humble sugars are transmuted into alcohol and a symphony of flavors. In these early days of brewing, before Louis Pasteur revealed the secrets of yeast in the 19th century, the brewer didn't fully grasp what yeast was. They knew something made the wort bubble and froth, transforming it into intoxicating ale. But this something was often attributed to divine intervention, mischievous sprites, or simply the inherent nature of the ingredients. They were relying almost entirely on wild yeast. These microscopic fungi were literally in the air, clinging to the surfaces of the brewery, residing on the skins of fruits or grains used nearby, and, most importantly, deeply embedded within the very wood of their fermentation tuns. Every batch was an open invitation for whatever local airborne or resident microbes fancied a sugary feast. This, my friend, was spontaneous fermentation in its truest, most roulette wheel form. The gamble was very real. Sometimes, the right kinds of yeast, predominantly strains of Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the classic ale yeast, would dominate, leading to a delightful, clean-tasting ale with pleasant fruity esters. But often, it was a microbial free-for-all. Other wild yeasts, like Brettanomyces, might join the party, imparting those earthy barnyard or leathery notes that modern sour beer aficionados sometimes cherish, but which might have been less welcome in an everyday medieval pint. And then there were the bacteria, Lactobacillus and Pediococcus, always lurking, ready to turn the sweet wort into something tart, sour, or even vinegary if given half a chance. Trying to explain good versus bad, invisible fermenting spirits to a medieval brewer would be like trying to explain the concept of cloud computing to a particularly stubborn goat. They just knew that sometimes the brew turned out wonderfully, and other times it produced something that could double as a particularly aggressive drain cleaner. And the vessels themselves? These were characters in their own right. Forget gleaming stainless steel, you're looking at massive wooden tuns, barrels, or open-topped casks, often gnarled and ancient, passed down through generations of brewers. Wood, as we've touched upon, is porous, it breathes, and it remembers. No matter how diligently they were scrubbed, perhaps with sand and water, or with bristly brooms made of birch twigs, or even by scouring them with bundles of abrasive herbs like juniper boughs. Chosen for their aromatic and mildly antiseptic qualities, these wooden vats were never truly sterile. They became inoculated over time with a complex community of microorganisms, a unique house culture. This could be a blessing, imparting a consistent and desirable character to the brewery's ales if the right microbes took up residence. Or it could be a curse, like with a persistent spoilage organism, leading to batch after batch of problematic beer. Before the fermentation could begin in earnest, the hot wort, fresh from the boil with its groot herbs, had to be cooled down. If it was too hot when it encountered the yeast or when the yeast spontaneously encountered it, the delicate little fungi would be killed. Cooling often involved transferring the wort to large, shallow open vessels called cool ships or coolers. sometimes just wide wooden troughs or lead-lined pans, and leaving it exposed to the ambient air. You can imagine these great steaming mirrors of wort, often placed in a drafty part of the brew house or even outside on a cool night. This was, of course, another prime opportunity for a diverse range of wild yeasts and bacteria floating in the air to dive in and make themselves at home. It was like putting out a welcome mat and a buffet for every microbe in a 5-mile radius. Come on in. The wort's lovely and still a bit warm. Bring your cousins. The brewer might as well have shouted to the breeze. Once cooled and residing in its wooden fermenter, the signs of life would slowly begin. A gentle bubbling, then a more vigorous churning, and finally, the development of a thick, rocky head of foam called a krausen. The air would fill with the pungent, fruity, and yeasty aromas of active fermentation, a sign that the magic was working. This process also generated its own heat. In those large wooden vessels, without refrigeration or cooling coils, managing fermentation temperature was a huge challenge. If it got too warm, the yeast could become stressed, producing harsh off flavors, too cool, and the fermentation might become sluggish, stall entirely, or allow less desirable cold-tolerant microbes to gain an advantage. Brewers might try to mitigate this by moving smaller barrels to cooler cellars or wrapping damp cloths around the tons to provide some evaporative cooling. But it was a constant battle against the elements. Over time, brewers began to notice that the foamy yeast skimmed from the top of a vigorously fermenting batch, known as barm, or the thick sediment left at the bottom after fermentation lees could be used to start the next batch more reliably. This was a monumental, albeit still empirical, step forward. They would carefully collect this precious barm, a living, breathing culture, and pitch it into the cooled wort. This practice of repitching significantly improved consistency and reduced the reliance on purely spontaneous inoculation. This barm was so valuable that it became a commodity in itself. This leads to an important historical fact. This yeast-rich barm wasn't just coveted by brewers. Bakers quickly discovered its power to leaven bread, making it lighter and airier than breads made with older sourdough methods. A lively trade in barm often existed between brewers and bakers, a delicious symbiotic relationship that benefited both bread and ale. Some households might even keep their own barm pot, carefully nurtured like a sourdough starter today. Their idea of a pure yeast culture was probably the gunk skimmed off the top of the barrel that didn't smell too much like old cheese. "Smells like ale to be," the brewer would declare, ever the optimist. For a quirky tidbit, imagine the personal touches. Some brewers might have had a favorite stirring stick, used only for rousing a sluggish fermentation or for pitching their precious barm. Over years of use, such a stick could become thoroughly impregnated with their house yeast strains, essentially becoming a primitive yeast bank. Others might have sung to their fermenting ale or had specific locations in the brewery, away from drafts or direct sunlight, where they believed the good spirits of fermentation were strongest. The nature of these mixed fermentations means that medieval ales likely had a far wider range of flavors than most modern beers. Historians still argue about the dominant yeast profiles in most medieval ales. While Saccharomyces cerevisiae was undoubtedly the primary workhorse for alcohol production, to what extent did other microbes like Brettanomyces or various lactic acid bacteria intentionally or unintentionally contribute to the common flavor profiles? Were these funky, tart, or earthy notes sometimes considered desirable regional characteristics, or simply tolerated as part of the ale-making lottery? It's a fascinating question, suggesting a lost world of complex flavors that we can only begin to imagine or replicate today through the study of historical brewing methods and surviving traditional farmhouse ales. For the medieval brewer, each bubbling vat was a fresh roll of the dice. That roll of the dice in the fermentation vat, with its wild yeasts and resident microbes, could already lead to some surprisingly complex and occasionally alarming flavor profiles. But our medieval ancestors never once to shy away from a bit of experimentation, or perhaps desperation, didn't always stop there. Oh no. Sometimes they looked at their bubbling brew, the product of so much labor with grains and water and mysterious groot herbs, and thought, you know what this needs? Something extra? And that extra, my friends, is where we venture into the realm of truly strange brews, curious concoctions, and odd additives that would make even the most adventurous modern craft brewer pause and possibly reach for a safety manual. Why did they do it? Why add ingredients that, to our modern palates, sound bizarre or even downright unappetizing? The motivations were as varied as the additives themselves. Sometimes it was a genuine quest for unique flavors and aromas, an attempt to create a signature brew that stood out from the crowd, or perhaps to mask the less desirable off notes that a particularly wild fermentation might have gifted them. Remember, consistency was a constant battle. If a batch went a bit sour or developed a peculiar twang, a strategic addition of a potent spice or strongly flavored herb might just rescue it from the drain, or at least make it interestingly peculiar rather than just plain bad. Then there were the medicinal or psychoactive intentions. Building upon what we saw with Groot, many ales were considered health tonics, and specific ingredients might be added to target particular ailments or to enhance vitality. And yes, some brews were undoubtedly designed to offer more than just alcoholic inebriation. They were intended to heighten the senses, induce vivid dreams, or act as aphrodisiacs. The line between a pint and a potion was often wonderfully blurry. And, of course, and in times of scarcity, sheer necessity might drive a brewer to incorporate whatever remotely fermentable or flavorful bits and pieces they could find. So, what kind of extra are we talking about? Let's peek into the medieval brewer's more adventurous ingredient chest. You might find them considering mushrooms. Now, tread carefully here in your imagination. While some non-toxic fungi could certainly add earthy umami notes to a brew, there's always been speculation about the more neurologically adventurous varieties. We're not suggesting every medieval ale was a psychedelic trip in a tankard, but certain fungi with known psychoactive properties were part of the folk pharmacopoeia, and it's not impossible that some found their way into closely guarded recipes for special occasion ales, intended for ritual use or very specific experiences. You take a sip and find the patterns on the taproom wall suddenly taking on a life of their own. Tree barks and resins were also fair game. Pine resin, for instance, has a long history as a flavoring and preservative in wine-think Greek retsina, and its use likely extended to some ales, imparting a sharp, foresty tang. Birch bark, oak bark, or other astringent barks might have been used for bitterness or for their supposed medicinal benefits, contributing tannins and complex woody notes. Imagine an ale with the robust character of an ancient forest, a drink that tasted of deep woods and damp earth. And then we venture into ingredients that might raise a modern eyebrow even higher. Eggs, for example. While more commonly associated with later possets and eggnogs, the idea of enriching drinks with eggs for nutrition and texture wasn't new. A raw egg cracked into a struggling fermentation, or perhaps added to a finished ale for body and richness, isn't beyond the realm of possibility for a hearty, restorative brew. Some even theorize that powdered eggshells might have been used as a rudimentary fining agent to help clarify cloudy ales. More common and less eyebrow-raising, but still a significant additive, was honey. Adding honey to ale created braggot, a rich, strong, mead-ale hybrid that combined the malty goodness of ale with the floral sweetness and fermentable power of honey. These were often potent brews, saved for celebrations. Now, for a truly classic example of a strange brew, we have to talk about cock ale. This is a well-documented historical fact, not just fanciful speculation. Cock ale, recipes for which appear from the later medieval period right up into the 17th and 18th centuries, involved adding a rooster, yes, a whole chicken, though usually parboiled or roasted first, to the fermenting or conditioning ale. Sometimes it was just parts of the bird, sometimes the whole creature, bones and all, occasionally with spices like mace or cloves. The belief was that this brew was incredibly restorative, a potent tonic for invalids, or even an aphrodisiac. You can just imagine the scene: another pint of the usual landlord, and make mine a feathered one. It certainly gives new meaning to a full bodied beer. Spices, beyond those typically found in Groot, also played a role, especially as trade routes opened up. Black pepper, grains of paradise with their pungent, cardamom like notes, ginger, cloves. These expensive and exotic spices could turn an ordinary ale into a luxurious, warming winter treat, or a brew fit for a lord's table. Even soot or charcoal might have been occasionally added, perhaps for color, or based on some now obscure medicinal belief. Coastal communities might have even experimented with seaweed, lending a briny, umami complexity to their local ales, a sort of medieval oyster stout without the oysters. It's clear that the medieval ale wasn't always just a simple quaffing beverage. It could be a complex culinary creation, a medicinal draft, or a psychoactive concoction. You might order a special from the alewife down the lane and receive something with an ingredient list that seemed to be a collaborative effort between a forager, an apothecary, and perhaps a slightly eccentric chef who just raided a spice merchant's cart. The lines were beautifully, and sometimes perilously, blurred. This leads to a quirky tidbit. Given the belief in sympathetic magic, some love potions or ales brewed for specific magical intentions might have contained truly bizarre and symbolic ingredients. Things we probably shouldn't detail before bedtime, but you can let your imagination wander safely. More concretely, certain herbs known to induce particularly vivid dreams or a sense of euphoria might be deliberately included in small quantities in ales intended for festivals or divination, aiming to enhance the celebratory mood or open the drinker's mind to other perceptions. You'd take a sip and feel like you could suddenly understand what the cat was complaining about. Naturally, with such a wide range of potent and sometimes dangerous substances being experimented with, historians still argue about the intent and prevalence of some of the more extreme additives. When old texts mention ingredients that seem overtly toxic or hallucinogenic, was it for a genuine, if risky, desired effect? Was it an accidental contamination or a misidentification of an herb? Could it have been a scribe's error, or even a brewer boasting about the mind-altering potency of their ales to attract thrill-seeking customers? The truth is likely a mix of all these things, but it certainly paints a picture of a brewing world far wilder and more unpredictable than our own. Their unofficial brewer's motto might well have been, "If it doesn't outright poison you, it might just make your evening considerably more memorable." Customer satisfaction, after all, can be a very flexible concept, especially after a tankard or two of the house special. Now, while some brewers out in the bustling villages and shadowy forests were indeed living by that rather adventurous motto we just discussed, if it doesn't outright poison you, it might just make your evening considerably more memorable. There was another, often more serene, center of brewing excellence. Here, memorable was hopefully achieved through quality and consistency, rather than by accidentally invoking talking squirrels after a sip of something particularly experimental. Let's leave those wilder shores of brewing for a moment and gently push open the heavy oak doors of a medieval monastery. Within these hallowed stone walls, brewing was often elevated to a true art form, a patient quest for what you might call God's own ale. Monasteries in the medieval period were far more than just places of prayer and quiet contemplation, though there was certainly plenty of that. They were vibrant hubs of learning, agriculture, craftsmanship, and remarkable self-sufficiency. And a crucial part of that self-sufficiency, and indeed their famed hospitality, was the production of ale. Why did monks dedicated to a life of spiritual devotion spend so much time and effort brewing well? For one, ale was a dietary staple, often referred to as liquid bread. It provided essential calories and nutrients, especially important during periods of fasting like Lent, when solid food intake was restricted. For monks engaged in hard physical labor in the fields or scriptoria, A hearty ale was both sustenance and refreshment. Hospitality was another key driver. The Rule of St. Benedict, a foundational text for Western monasticism from the 6th century onwards, explicitly instructed monks to welcome all guests, especially pilgrims and the poor, as if they were Christ himself. This is a significant historical fact, providing for guests naturally included offering them food and drink. And in much of Europe, good ale was an expected part of that welcome. A weary traveler arriving at a monastery gate would often be greeted with a cup of ale to revive their spirits. Furthermore, any surplus ale could be sold to the local populace or traded, providing a valuable source of income to support the monastery's charitable works and upkeep. And, of course, just like everyone else in the medieval world, monks knew that properly brewed ale was generally a safer drink than water from potentially dubious sources. Monasteries possessed several advantages that allowed them to excel at brewing. Firstly, literacy and record-keeping were commonplace within their walls. While the village alewife might rely on memory and oral tradition, monks could consult written recipes, note down the results of different batches, track ingredient quantities, and observe the effects of varying their techniques. This allowed for a gradual refinement of the brewing process over generations. Imagine Brother Thomas the Cellarer meticulously noting in a ledger, Anno Domini 1253, added 3 extra measures of yarrow to the Whitsun ale. Result, Abbot complained less about the usual spring melancholy. Possible improvement. Progress. 1 carefully documented pint at a time. They often had access to better resources too. Monastic estates frequently included prime agricultural land, allowing them to cultivate high-quality barley. Many monasteries were strategically sited near reliable springs or had well-constructed wells, ensuring a supply of cleaner water. Their brewhouses, while still medieval, were often larger, better equipped, and perhaps maintained with a greater degree of order and cleanliness than many secular operations. Brewing could also be a dedicated, specialized role within the monastic hierarchy. The cellarer, for instance, was the monk responsible for provisioning the entire community, and this often included overseeing the malthouse and brewery. This specialization allowed for the development of considerable expertise. Their motto was often ora et labora, pray and work. And if your work involved brewing a particularly heavenly pint that perhaps made the evening vespers feel a little more uplifting, well, that could be seen as efficient spiritual multitasking, couldn't it? The types of ale produced would vary. There would certainly be a strong, well-brewed ale, the bona cervisia, reserved for the abbot, important guests, and for feast days. Then there'd be the monk's daily ale, a more moderate brew, and often a weaker, small beer would be produced for novices, lay brothers, or distributed as part of their charitable obligations to the poor. The monastic infirmary might also have its own special brews, perhaps infused with medicinal herbs, created under the guidance of the infirmary monk who tended the sick. This environment of stability, resources, and dedicated focus naturally led to a refinement of brewing techniques. While they didn't have the scientific understanding we possess today, monks, through careful observation and iterative improvement, likely made empirical advances. They might have become adept at selecting the best grain varieties, honing their malting and mashing techniques to achieve better sugar extraction, even if they didn't fully understand the enzyme chemistry, and patiently cultivating their own house strains of barm for more consistent fermentations. Their use of grute, and in later medieval periods in certain regions, hops, would also have benefited from this considered approach. They were, in a very real sense, seeking both divine and potable inspiration. This isn't to say monastic brewing was always perfect or scientifically advanced by our standards. They still faced the same fundamental challenges of medieval life: unpredictable weather affecting harvests, the mysteries of fermentation, and the limitations of their technology. However, the structured, scholarly environment of the monastery provided a fertile ground for brewing to flourish beyond simple rustic necessity. For a quirky tidbit, It's easy to imagine that some monastic breweries developed secret ingredients, perhaps a particular herb grown only in their physic garden, or specific blessings and rituals performed over the mash tun or fermentation vats. The success of their ale might be attributed as much to divine favor or the intercession of their monastery's patron saint as to the cellarer's earthly skill. Perhaps Sonia Cranesite, Adrian of Nicomedia, one of the patron saints of brewers, received a lot of urgent prayers on brew days. Historians still argue about the precise extent to which monastic breweries were true innovators in brewing technology, or whether their primary contribution was more in the diligent preservation, consistent application, and gradual refinement of existing knowledge, thanks to their unique stability and resources. Were they groundbreaking inventors, or just exceptionally good students and practitioners of an ancient craft? The answer is probably a bit of both. What is certain is that the legacy of monastic brewing is long and flavorful, echoing down even to the present day in the renowned beers still produced by some Trappist monasteries, a tradition with roots deep in these medieval cloisters. You can almost picture a stern abbot doing a quality control check. Brother Michael, the bishop is arriving next week. Ensure the abbot's delight is suitably delightful, and perhaps hide that experimental batch you called Seraphim's Surprise. Oh, we aim for contemplative, not comatose. That pursuit of contemplative, or at least consistently drinkable, ale within monastery walls was certainly one important thread in our medieval brewing tapestry. But if you were an ordinary villager, a thirsty farmhand, or a traveler on a dusty road, chances are your daily pint didn't come from a monk with a quill and a carefully maintained ledger. Much more likely, it came from a woman, a brewster, an alewife, whose brew house was often her own kitchen, and whose legacy, despite its immense importance, is too often unsung. It's time to step away from the quiet cloisters and into the bustling, sometimes chaotic world of these female brewers to understand their craft, their contributions, and to hear a whisper of the alewife's lament. For a vast stretch of the medieval period, particularly in the earlier centuries and in more rural settings, brewing was predominantly women's work. It was a natural extension of household duties, much like baking bread or tending a kitchen garden. You, as a medieval woman, might be responsible for ensuring your family had a steady supply of ale, not just as a beverage, but as a vital source of calories and hydration. This was brewing on a domestic scale, woven into the rhythm of daily life. The equipment was likely rudimentary, perhaps a single large pot for both mashing and boiling, a few wooden tubs for fermentation, all fitting within the confines of a small cottage. While Brother Cuthbert in the monastery down the road might be having deep theological discussions about the precise angel to barley kernel ratio required for his divinely inspired strong ale, Goodwife Agnes in the village was probably just trying to make enough drinkable ale to keep her family going, pay the tithe, and maybe stop her children from using the mash paddle as a makeshift sword. Priorities, you see. Many of these women, however, didn't just brew for their own families. They became small-scale entrepreneurs. An alewife with a knack for brewing, or perhaps a widow needing to support herself, would produce a surplus and sell it to her neighbors or to passers-by. This was an incredibly important economic activity for women, offering a degree of financial independence that was rare in medieval society. You'd know ale was for sale by the ale stake. This is a well-documented historical fact. An ale stake was typically a simple pole, often with a bush, a garland of greenery, or even a brightly colored cloth tied to its end, thrust out horizontally from the house, sometimes over the doorway. It was the medieval equivalent of a pub sign, an instantly recognizable invitation to come in and quench your thirst. These alewives, or brewsters as they were also known, possessed a wealth of practical brewing knowledge. While they might not have kept meticulous written records like their monastic counterparts, they inherited generations of oral tradition and hands-on experience. They understood the qualities of local grains, the secrets of their family's groot recipes, which might include foraged herbs unique to their area, the temperament of their particular wooden fermentation vessels, and the subtle signs that a brew was progressing well or heading for trouble. They were skilled artisans, adapting their methods to the changing seasons, the availability of ingredients, and the limitations of their often very basic equipment. The alewife's home often became more than just a place to buy a drink. It evolved into a local social hub. In the absence of many formal public houses, especially in smaller villages, people would gather at the alewife's to drink, chat, exchange news, and play games. It was the heart of the community, a place where local gossip was shared as freely as the ale itself. Imagine the scene: a smoky, dimly lit room, the murmur of conversation, the clinking of pottery cups, the alewife herself presiding over it all, perhaps with a sharp wit and a keen ear for village happenings. But as we move into the later medieval period, a change begins to creep in, and this is where we hear the lament. As brewing became more commercialized and recognized as a potentially very profitable industry, it started to attract more male attention and, crucially, more regulation from authorities like town councils and the burgeoning guild system. These changes often systematically disadvantaged the small-scale female brewer. Brewing guilds, when they formed, were almost exclusively male domains. They set standards, controlled apprenticeships, and often used their influence to limit or outright prohibit women from brewing commercially, or at least from selling ale in larger quantities or in more formal public settings. Alongside these structural changes, negative stereotypes about alewives began to circulate more widely in popular culture, literature, and art. The alewife was sometimes depicted as a cheat, accused of adulterating her ale with unsavory ingredients to stretch her profits, or of giving short measures in her cups. She might be portrayed as a gossip, a shrew, or even more sinisterly, as someone associated with witchcraft. That iconic image of a witch with a cauldron, a pointed hat, and a black cat. Some scholars suggest that elements of this imagery might have been co-opted or twisted from the visual identifiers of the alewife, her brewing cauldron, the tall conical hat some wore for visibility in crowded markets, and the cat, a common household mouser. Whether this direct link is fully accurate or not, the association was damaging, helping to discredit female brewers and push them to the margins of an increasingly male-dominated and professionalized trade. If an alewife was caught giving what was deemed a short measure, she might face public humiliation like being paraded through the streets or put in the stocks. If a larger guild-affiliated male brewer's barrel turned out to be a bit light, it was probably put down to acceptable losses during transport or a slight anomaly in the cooperage. Funny how that often worked out. Economic pressures also mounted. Larger breweries, with more capital, better equipment, and often political connections, could produce ale more efficiently and in greater volumes. Undercutting the prices of the small batch alewife, it became harder and harder for women to compete. Historians still argue about the primary driving forces behind this significant decline of women in the brewing trade. Was it predominantly these economic shifts towards larger-scale industrialization? Was it the deliberate exclusionary practices of male-dominated guilds and authorities who saw a lucrative business and wanted to control it? Or was it part of a broader societal shift in gender roles and perceptions of women's work? Most likely, it was a complex interplay of all these factors. Despite these challenges, the quirky and tenacious spirit of the alewife undoubtedly persisted in pockets. You can imagine some developing incredibly unique, unwritten Groot recipes, fiercely guarded family secrets passed down from mother to daughter, making their particular ale a local legend. Perhaps they had lucky brewing charms, specific songs they hummed while stirring the mash, or a particular way of reading the bubbles in the fermenter that told them exactly when the ale was ready. Skills born of intuition and generations of close observation. They were the original microbrewers, the backbone of local ale production for centuries. Their contributions vital, even if often overlooked by the grander narratives of history. They weren't just making ale, they were sustaining families, fostering communities, and a few were probably fighting off accusations of turning their neighbors into newts all while trying to make a decent, honest pint. That decent, honest pint from the local alewife, or the carefully crafted brew from the monastery, was the lifeblood of daily existence, the familiar hum in the background of medieval life. But this life, for all its undeniable hardships and routines, was also dramatically punctuated by moments of intense communal celebration, solemn remembrance, and every significant rite of passage in between. And for every one of these pivotal occasions, you can be sure a special ale was brewed, a potent, carefully considered concoction designed not just to quench thirst, but to amplify joy, soothe sorrow, or mark a sacred moment in time. So, let's leave the everyday table beer for a moment and explore the richer, stronger, and often highly symbolic world of festival ales and funeral feasts, where brewing went beyond mere sustenance and became a ceremony in a cup. Ale was absolutely central to social rituals. A birth in the village, ale would flow to welcome the new life and wet the baby's head. As they said, a marriage. This called for a bride ale or bridal, a term whose very roots point to the brewing traditions surrounding weddings. This wasn't just any ale, it was often a particularly strong, fine brew, made with the best ingredients the families could afford, symbolizing abundance and good fortune for the happy couple. The celebrations might go on for days, fueled by this special brew. Then there were the church ales. These were fascinating events, particularly common in medieval England, where ale was brewed and sold, often by the churchwardens themselves, to raise funds for the parish. Imagine a kind of medieval church fete, but with a lot more ale. These would take place on religious holidays like Whitsunday or Easter, or to mark a patron saint's day. They often involved huge feasts, communal drinking, games, dancing, and theatrical performances like mystery plays. It was a way for the community to come together, have a good time, and contribute to the upkeep of their church or the support of the poor. Planning for the annual church ale must have been quite the undertaking. Right then, committee, we need enough of the parishioners' prudence porter to make everyone feel generous towards the new bell fund, but not so much that old man Hemlock starts trying to argue theology with the weathercock again. It's a delicate balance. People similar in spirit were the Scott ales or help ales. These were communal brewing efforts where individuals would contribute malt, firewood, labor, or money towards a collective brew. The resulting ale would then be sold or consumed at a feast, with the proceeds going to help a member of the community who had fallen on hard times. Perhaps their house had burned down, or they'd lost their livestock. It was a beautiful expression of medieval solidarity, a social safety net lubricated by shared ale. Even moments of sorrow were marked by special brews. Funeral ales, sometimes known as dirge ales or arval ales, from the Old Norse word for inheritance feast, were an essential part of medieval mourning rituals. After the solemnities of the burial, mourners would gather to share food and drink, and a specific ale, often strong and dark, would be served. This wasn't necessarily about drowning sorrows in a raucous wake, though some celebrations of life could be quite lively. It was about honoring the deceased, providing comfort to the bereaved, and reaffirming community bonds in the face of loss. There was a sense of solemn respect in these brews, because, let's be honest, sometimes the best way to say, "We'll miss him terribly," he was a pillar of the community, is with a pint so profoundly fortifying it makes you temporarily forget your own earthly woes. It's what he would have wanted. Probably. Agricultural milestones were also key brewing occasions. The end of the harvest, a critical time of year, was celebrated with harvest ales. These were joyous, often spiced or fruit-infused brews, shared amongst everyone who had toiled in the fields. A traditional drink called lamb's wool, often associated with wassail celebrations around autumn or midwinter, was typically a warm ale mixed with roasted apples, nutmeg, and ginger, a truly comforting and festive concoction. And then there were cuckoo ales, brewed to welcome the arrival of spring, around the time the first cuckoo's call was heard, a cheerful signal that winter's grip was finally loosening. What set these festival ales apart? Firstly, their strength. These weren't your watery small beers for everyday hydration. Festival ales were typically brewed with a much higher proportion of malt, resulting in a richer flavor and, crucially, a higher alcohol content. This was the good stuff, the October ale, so called, because autumn's cooler temperatures were ideal for brewing and conditioning stronger beers intended for keeping. Carefully brewed and sometimes aged for special occasions, they would also boast superior ingredients, the best barley the village or household could muster, perhaps clearer water and more exotic or plentiful flavorings. Think rich Groot blends, expensive imported spices if the occasion and budget allowed, or generous additions of honey to create something truly luxurious. And, of course, they were brewed in larger quantities, intended to serve a crowd and keep the celebratory or commemorative spirit flowing. The brewing process for these special ales might itself involve more care, more expense, and even a touch more ritual. The brewer, whether a skilled alewife, a monastic cellarer, or a designated village expert, would pour all their knowledge and perhaps a few extra prayers into these significant batches. These ales weren't just beverages, they were tangible expressions of community, binding people together through shared experience. They marked rites of passage, reinforced social hierarchies, the best ale for the Lord, a good ale for the common folk, and provided a vital outlet for collective joy, religious observance, or communal grief. For a quirky tidbit, many of these festival ales would have specific local names, perhaps tied to a village legend, the saint being celebrated, or a humorous anecdote from a previous year's festival. There might also have been particular rituals associated with their consumption. The first ladleful offered to the guest of honor or the village elder, a specific toast that had to be made, or a communal loving cup passed around the gathering. At harvest festivals, a particularly fine sheaf of barley, perhaps decorated with ribbons, might be ceremonially drowned in the first cask of harvest ale, a symbolic offering of thanks. Given the often potent nature of these brews and the emotionally charged atmospheres in which they were consumed, historians still argue about their full impact. When contemporary accounts describe people at festivals experiencing visions, behaving in ecstatic ways, or feeling a profound sense of communal unity, was it solely the effect of strong alcohol, or did the unique herbal additions in some of these ales, combined with the psychological power of music, dancing, and ritual, contribute to genuinely altered states of consciousness? It's a tantalizing question, suggesting that some medieval festivals might have been far more intense experiences than a modern village fair. Your average Tuesday ale might have kept you going about your day, but the ale brewed for the feast of Saint Crispin, that was the brew that could inspire you to believe you could mend shoes with the skill of a master cobbler, sing with the voice of a celestial choir, or perhaps even understand the intricate politics of the local badger set. Results always varied, but a memorable time was generally guaranteed. Those memorable festival ales, potent and hopefully joyous, were the highlights of the medieval drinking calendar, the liquid exclamation points of communal life. But for every glorious batch that brought cheer to a wedding, or solace to a funeral, there lurked the ever-present pungent shadow of brewing gone wrong. Because, my friends, beneath the rustic charm and whispered traditions of ancient crafts often lies the sour truth not every medieval ale was a winner. In fact, some of it was probably downright challenging, to put it mildly. So, take a deep breath. Perhaps not too deep if you're imagining a truly off batch, as we confront the ever-present dangers of tainted brews and the real risk that sometimes came with that medieval pint. We've journeyed through the brewhouse and seen the process, warts and all, the reliance on wild yeast, the Herculean task of cleaning porous wooden vessels, the often dubious water sources, and the general lack of understanding about what we now call microbiology. It was a perfect storm for spoilage. You take a tentative sip of the latest offering from the village brewer, and it was always a bit of a lottery. Would it be? A pleasant hint of orchard fruit and toasted grain. Or more like, good heavens, Has a family of particularly athletic mice been doing aerobics in this barrel and left their gym socks behind? The most common complaint, the bane of many a medieval drinker, was sourness. Allay that had turned was a familiar woe. This was usually the handiwork of unwelcome bacterial guests like lactobacillus or pediococcus, which happily convert residual sugars into lactic acid, giving the ale a tart, yogurty, or even sharply vinegary tang if acetobacter, which produces acetic acid. The main component of vinegar also joined the fray. While a controlled sourness is a prized characteristic in some modern beers, an unexpected and aggressive sour bomb in your daily medieval ale was probably less delightful. Then there was the dreaded ropiness. Certain bacteria, like some strains of pediococcus, could produce long chains of sugars called exopolysaccharides, turning the ale into a thick, slimy, viscous liquid that would pour with an unsettling, stringy consistency. Imagine trying to drink something with the texture of thin wallpaper paste. Not exactly refreshing, though generally not harmful, just deeply unpleasant. And the off flavors, oh, the symphony of potential olfactory offenses. Medicinal or phenolic notes, often from wild yeast or certain bacteria, could make your ale taste like a forgotten bottle from the back of an apothecary's shelf. The infamous barnyard aroma, a hallmark of some Brettanomyces strains, could range from an interesting earthy funk to something more akin to, well, an actual poorly maintained barnyard. Solvent-like notes, reminiscent of nail polish remover, could also make an unwelcome appearance if the fermentation got too stressed or contaminated. And, of course, mold contamination from damp grain or improperly cleaned equipment could lend its own musty, earthy, and generally unpalatable signature. What caused these medieval brewing catastrophes? Poor sanitation was the arch-villain, naturally. Those beloved wooden tuns and barrels, with their nooks, crannies, and ancient beer-soaked pours, were five-star hotels for spoilage microbes. Incorrect temperatures during mashing, fermentation, or storage could also give the wrong kinds of beasties an advantage. Leaving the wort or ale exposed to the air for too long invited oxidation and aerobic spoilers like acetobacter. A weak wort, low in sugar and therefore producing less protective alcohol, was also more vulnerable. And sometimes, the ingredients themselves, particularly moldy or poorly stored grain, brought their own unwelcome contributions to the party. So, what did you do if your precious batch of ale went south? Remedies were often desperate and rarely effective. Some might try reboiling the soured ale, perhaps with more herbs or spices thrown in to mask the off flavors, a bit like trying to hide a skunk with a sprig of parsley. Others might risk blending the spoiled batch with a fresh one, hoping to dilute the problem, though this often just ended up contaminating the good ale too. If the ale had gone full-blown acetic, it could at least be used as ale vinegar for cooking or preserving. More often than not, a truly bad batch was relegated to the pigs who were probably less discerning customers, or simply poured onto the ground with a sigh and a vow to scrub the barrels better next time. Or if it was just mildly off and there was nothing else to drink, people might have just held their noses and endured it. Waste not, want not. Even if want not meant, really wish I didn't have to drink this. Of course, consuming these tainted brews wasn't just an assault on the taste buds. It could be a genuine health risk. Gastrointestinal distress, an upset stomach, diarrhea, perhaps a bout of what they might have quaintly termed the flux or the gripes was a common consequence of drinking ale that was teeming with unwelcome microbes. While the boiling of the wort killed many pathogens from the initial water source, post-boil contamination was a constant threat. If particularly nasty bacteria found their way into the cooling wort or the fermentation vessel, more serious illnesses could follow. Medieval court records and town ordinances, a key historical fact, frequently mention cases against brewers for selling corrupt, false, or unwholesome ale. This shows that spoilage was not only common but also a recognized public health concern. Towns often appointed officials called ale conners or ale tasters, whose job it was to inspect ale for quality. Punishments for selling bad ale could range from fines to public humiliation, like being placed in the cucking stool a chair at the end of a long pole. Used to dunk offenders in water or even being forced to drink a large quantity of their own offensive brew. The medieval equivalent of a product recall for particularly foul ale probably involved the town crier bellowing, "Hear ya, hear ya." Goodwife Grummet's latest brew is currently auditioning for a role as Dragon's Breath. Approach with caution, or preferably, not at all. For a quirky tidbit, when a batch did go mysteriously wrong, brewers with a less scientific mindset might not blame their sanitation. Instead, they might point the finger at witchcraft, a curse from a disgruntled neighbor, or mischievous household spirits like Puck or other hobgoblins who were believed to delight in spoiling milk, beer, or tormenting bakers. They might even have specific, though likely useless, charms they'd mutter over the barrels, or hang certain herbs around the brewery, not for flavor, but to ward off these invisible saboteurs. This brings us to an interesting point of scholarly debate. What was the general tolerance level among medieval populations for these off flavors? In a world without refrigeration and with limited understanding of spoilage, was a certain degree of tartness, funkiness, or even slight sourness simply accepted as a normal characteristic of ale, especially older ale or were medieval drinkers, within the bounds of their knowledge, just as discerning as we are today, constantly seeking out the freshest, cleanest tasting brews and vocally complaining about anything subpar? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, a higher tolerance born of necessity, but a definite appreciation for a well-made pint when they could get one. Some ales were probably so far gone. They could have been used to tan hides or negotiate peace treaties through sheer olfactory intimidation. It's not spoiled ale, Your Majesty. It's strategically pungent, that constant threat of your precious ale turning into something that could strip paint or perhaps challenge a particularly grumpy badger to a staring contest, meant that medieval brewers weren't just focused on making ale. They were also locked in a perpetual, often uphill, battle to keep it drinkable. Without the magic of refrigeration, without the gleaming chillers and temperature-controlled fermentation tanks of today, how on earth did they attempt to preserve their brews and keep them cool? Or at least, sort of cool, in a world dictated by the whims of the seasons? Let's delve into the ingenious, if often thoroughly inadequate, world of primitive preservation. The core challenge, of course, was temperature. Ale, like any fermented beverage, is a living thing, full of microbes that are sensitive to warmth. Too much heat accelerates spoilage, encourages the wrong kinds of beasties to thrive, and can turn a promising pint into a puckeringly sour disappointment in a remarkably short time. Medieval brewers knew this, even if they didn't understand the microbiology. They observed that ale kept in a cool place lasted longer and tasted better. They also empirically understood a few key factors that contributed to an ale's staying power. Higher alcohol content was a big one. Stronger ales, brewed with more malt, naturally resisted spoilage better than weak. Watery, small beers. The alcohol itself acted as a preservative. The herbs and spices in their Groot blends also played a role. Some, like bog myrtle or yarrow, possessed mild antimicrobial properties that could offer a little protection. And later in the medieval period, as hops began their slow march across Europe, their superior antibacterial qualities became a game-changer for brewing ales that could last longer and even travel. Minimizing exposure to air by keeping vessels as well sealed as possible also helped, though they wouldn't have known it was preventing oxidation or the growth of aerobic spoilers like Acetobacter. They just knew a tightly bunged cask often fared better. So, what were their methods for keeping it cool, sort of? The primary strategy was the cellar. If you were a brewer of any standing, or even a well-to-do household, a cool, dark cellar was your best friend. Dug deep into the earth, these subterranean spaces offered a more stable and significantly lower temperature than the sun-baked world above, especially during the heat of summer. You can imagine the brewer carefully lowering precious casks of ale into the damp, earthy-smelling gloom, hoping the consistent coolness would slow down the inevitable march toward spoilage. Sometimes, if a natural cave was available, that would serve as an even better, naturally temperature-controlled storage space. Their idea of a sophisticated long-term storage solution for a particularly prized barrel of strong ale might have been dig a really deep hole in the shadiest part of the north-facing hill. Stick the barrel in, cover it well, and pray to St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes and possibly slightly past its prime beer. In some instances, casks might even be partially buried in the cool earth of the cellar floor, or an outbuilding to further stabilize their temperature. Another tactic, though probably less common for large volumes, was water cooling. If a clean, cold stream ran nearby, or if there was a deep, cool well, casks might be carefully submerged or partially submerged to keep them chilled. This, of course, depended on having access to such a water source and the practicality of wrestling heavy barrels in and out of it. The vessels themselves played a part. Wooden casks were the norm. The quality of the wood, usually oak, and the skill of the cooper who made the barrel were paramount. A well-made, tight-fitting cask would leak less and offer better protection. To further seal the wood and make it less porous, brewers sometimes lined the inside of their casks with pitch, a type of pine resin. This coating helped to prevent the ale from seeping into the wood, and, as a bonus, the resin itself had some antimicrobial properties, though it could also impart its own distinct flavor to the brew, a bit like a medieval Retsina ale. Seasoning a cask was also important. A new cask might leach undesirable woody flavors, while a cask that had successfully held good ale might be believed to retain some of that good fortune, or perhaps a beneficial microbial character. One of the most effective strategies was brewing seasonally. Resourceful brewers knew that the cooler months, particularly autumn, were the best time for brewing ales intended for keeping. The ambient temperatures were lower, allowing for more controlled fermentation and maturation. These October beers, as they were often called, were typically brewed stronger and sometimes with more preservative herbs or hops. Where available, specifically designed to last through the winter and even into the following spring or summer. This is a key historical fact: the practice of brewing potent March beers, brewed in March to last into the warmer months. Or these October beers, for their superior keeping qualities, was well established by the later medieval period. For everyday, weaker ales, however, the most common preservation strategy was often much simpler: brew it in smaller, manageable batches and drink it fresh. The medieval best before date was less a specific day printed on a label and more a vague, sensory-driven assessment. This is starting to taste less like ale and more like a science experiment gone slightly rogue. Probably should invite the neighbors over and finish it up sharpish. Well, speed of consumption was often the best defense against spoilage for the common pint. The containers used for serving and shorter-term storage also mattered. While barrels were for bulk, smaller quantities might be decanted into pottery jugs or leather jacks. These could be sealed with wooden bungs, cloth stoppers, or even plugs of wax to try and keep the air out and the freshness in, for a little while at least. Even with all these efforts, keeping ale was a constant worry. For a quirky tidbit, it's easy to imagine brewers developing their own idiosyncratic beliefs about storage. Perhaps a certain corner of the cellar was deemed luckier than others, or they might hang charms like horseshoes or bundles of specific herbs like rowan, believed to ward off evil around their storage area to protect the precious ale from turning. Maybe they whispered encouraging words to their barrels, hoping to coax them into behaving. Now, Bartholomew the Barrel, none of your sour tricks this month. Be a good chap. How long could medieval ale actually last? Historians still argue about the average shelf life of typical brews. A strong, well-brewed, well-hopped in later periods, and properly cellared October ale might indeed last for many months, even improving with age like a fine wine. But common, weaker, unhopped, or lightly gruit-ed ales, their lifespan was likely measured in days or perhaps a few weeks at best, especially in warmer weather. before they became unpalatably sour or developed other off flavors. It would have varied hugely depending on the region, the season, the brewer's skill, and sheer luck. If your cellar was too warm or damp, your ale didn't just gently mature, it often underwent a rapid and rather aggressive midlife crisis, turning bitter, developing a film, and generally becoming a most disagreeable beverage. Much like some unfortunate acquaintances, really, that ongoing battle to keep ale from turning into a science experiment, often a losing one, meant that for many medieval folk, the freshest and perhaps most reliably palatable pint wasn't found lurking in a dusty cellar for months on end, but enjoyed in a more communal setting, ideally not long after it had finished its lively fermentation dance. So, let's you and I push past a creaking, ill-fitting wooden door. Allow our eyes a moment to adjust to the smoky gloom, or the flickering dance of tallow candlelight, and pull up a rough-hewn stool. You can almost feel the splinters. Welcome to the heart of medieval social life, the bustling, noisy, and utterly vital alehouse. This, my friend, is where ale transcended mere liquid refreshment. It became the very mortar holding together the often crumbly bricks of community and commerce. The medieval alehouse wasn't typically a grand, purpose-built establishment in its earliest forms. Often, as we've seen, it began as the humble dwelling of an alewife, her kitchen or main room serving as a makeshift public space, the simple ale stake outside heralding ale for sale. But as towns grew and society became more structured, more permanent alehouses and slightly more upmarket taverns, which might also offer wine and a wider range of services, began to emerge. Still, for the common person, the local alehouse was the go-to. Picture it, the floor might be packed earth, perhaps strewn with rushes that have seen better centuries, doing a questionable job of soaking up spills and whatever else found its way down there. The air is thick, a potent cocktail of wood smoke from the hearth. The sweet, malty aroma of ale hopefully good, possibly a bit funky, the smell of unwashed bodies packed in close, damp wool, and perhaps some rudimentary food being cooked. The noise level is a cheerful, chaotic din laughter, raised voices in animated conversation, the clatter of wooden cups or pottery tankards, perhaps the rhythmic thud of a dice game in a corner, or even a slightly off-key song being belted out by a group of merry locals. The clientele is a true cross-section of medieval society, particularly in a bustling town. You'd see local artisans and laborers unwinding after a hard day's work, their calloused hands wrapped around a cup. Farmers might be in from the countryside, discussing crop prices or the weather. Traveling merchants could be haggling over deals in a quieter corner, their packs and wares temporarily stowed. Perhaps a few scruffy, off-duty soldiers are recounting improbable tales of valor, or a group of university students are engaged in a loud, ale-fueled debate about an obscure point of philosophy. The medieval alehouse where you could find a pint of ale, the latest unsubstantiated rumor about the king's cousin's new dog, and quite possibly a stray chicken pecking under your stool, all for a few pennies. Full-service entertainment. Really. More than just a drinking den, the alehouse was the medieval equivalent of social media, the local newspaper, and the village hall all rolled into one. Here, news from afar was exchanged by travelers, local gossip was dissected with forensic enthusiasm, and community bonds were forged and reinforced. Business transactions were sealed with a shared cup of ale. Political opinions, carefully or recklessly, were aired. Marriages might be informally arranged, disputes mediated, and celebrations of every kind, from a new baby to a successfully mended roof, would find their joyful expression here. It was where you went to feel connected, to be part of the thrum of life. Commerce was deeply intertwined with the alehouse. Beyond the simple buying and selling of ale by the taverner, or alewife who was often a formidable business person in her own right. Managing supplies, customers, and a till full of mismatched coins, other business was frequently conducted. Laborers might gather hoping to be hired for the day. Guild members might hold informal meetings. The price of ale itself was often subject to local regulations. Like the assize of bread and ale in England, which attempted to link the price of a gallon to the price of grain. Ale conners, those official quality checkers we've met, would make their rounds, ensuring the ale wasn't too weak, too sour, or sold in short measures. A constant source of potential friction. Food, if available, was usually simple and hearty. Thick slabs of dark bread, chunks of strong cheese, pickled onions or eggs, perhaps a communal bowl of pottage, a thick vegetable and grain stew bubbling over the hearth. Often the ale itself, rich in calories from the malt, was considered a significant part of one's daily sustenance. Entertainment was largely self-made lively conversation, storytelling, and impromptu sing-alongs. Games of chance were ubiquitous, despite often being officially frowned upon or outright banned by authorities. Dice games like Hazard, simple card games once cards became more common, or board games like drafts checkers, tables backgammon, or even chess for the more intellectually inclined, would be played with gusto, wagers placed and tempers occasionally flared. If an alehouse wall from that era could talk, it would probably slur its words a bit, demand another pint for its troubles, and then regale you with some absolutely astonishing stories, half of which might even contain a kernel of truth. It was the original unfiltered newsfeed. Of course, it wasn't all rosy camaraderie and cheerful songs. The alehouse had its darker side. With copious amounts of ale flowing, drunkenness was common, leading to brawls, arguments, and petty crime. Gambling disputes could easily escalate. Alehouses were sometimes viewed with suspicion by church authorities and town officials as dens of iniquity, places where idle hands and loosened tongues could lead to trouble. This is why, as a historical fact, many medieval towns enacted specific regulations for alehouses. These could include strict opening and closing hours, no serving during church services. For instance, rules against admitting known troublemakers or harboring fugitives, prohibitions on certain rowdy games, and of course, the continued insistence on displaying a clear ale stake so everyone knew who was selling. For a quirky tidbit, individual alehouses often developed unique reputations. One might be known for the exceptional quality or notorious potency of its brew, another for the particular skill of its host in facilitating games or settling disputes. Perhaps one alehouse, near a monastery or university, was known as a gathering place for scholars and poets, while another, down by the docks, had a rougher, more transient clientele, and was whispered to be the place to go if you needed to discreetly hire a strong arm or hear news from the smuggling trade. The scholar's scuttlebutt versus the cutthroat's cup, if you will. The very nature and primary purpose of these early establishments is still a topic of some discussion. Historians still argue whether the earliest alehouses were predominantly straightforward economic ventures driven by the seller's need to make a living, or if they evolved more organically as essential social spaces for community bonding, information exchange, and mutual support, with the commercial aspect initially being almost secondary. It was likely a blend, with the social function and the economic incentive reinforcing each other. What is undeniable is that these bustling, fragrant, and sometimes fractious establishments were absolutely central to the texture of medieval life. The places where ordinary people lived out their daily dramas, one pint at a time. Their idea of a quiet night out might have involved just one minor disagreement over whose turn it was to buy the next round, and someone attempting to pay with a slightly used horseshoe. Standard medieval evening, really. That bustling alehouse, the vibrant heart of the medieval community, thrumming with life and countless tankards of ale, was itself on the cusp of a profound transformation, a shift that would ripple through its smoky rooms and out into the wider world of brewing. For centuries, as we've seen, the character of its ales had been largely defined by those mysterious, regionally diverse Groot mixtures, the bog myrtle, the yarrow, the wild rosemary, and 100 other fragrant herbs. But a new contender was quietly making its way into the brew kettle, a small, unassuming green cone that would forever alter the taste. The business, and indeed the very definition of beer. It's time now to witness the arrival of the hop, and the dawn of a brewing revolution that continues to shape the pint in your hand today. Hops. The female flower cones of the Humulus lupulus plant weren't entirely unknown in the earlier medieval period. They grew wild in many parts of Europe and were likely used sporadically for their medicinal properties, or perhaps as a minor, occasional ingredient in some local Groot blends. But their systematic cultivation and widespread use specifically for brewing began to take root, particularly in parts of what is now Germany and the Low Countries, from around the 11th to the 13th centuries. However, their march to dominance across the rest of Europe was a slow, often contested affair. What made hops so revolutionary? They brought three crucial qualities to the brew. Firstly, a clean, crisp bitterness that provided a delightful counterpoint to the sweetness of the malt, often perceived as more refreshing and less cloying than some of the complex, sometimes heavy, herbal notes of Groot. Secondly, hops contributed their own unique aromas and flavors. Floral, earthy, spicy, citrusy, though the nuanced understanding and cultivation of specific hop varieties for their aromatic profiles would develop much later. But the real game changer, the quality that truly propelled hops to stardom, was their remarkable preservative power. The resins found in hops, particularly compounds we now know as alpha acids, have significant antibacterial properties. This meant that hopped beer was far more resistant to spoilage than traditional Groot ales. It could be stored for longer periods, and, crucially, it could be transported over greater distances without turning into undrinkable vinegar. The Groot guilds, who held lucrative monopolies on the sale of herbal mixtures in many regions, probably had a whole PR team dedicated to a smear campaign against this upstart plant. Hops! You say those nasty, bitter, ungodly weeds, they'll curdle your humors and make your chickens stop laying. Stick to our lovely, wholesome, divinely approved bog myrtle blend. It's what your grandfather drank. The adoption of hopped beer, often simply called beer, to distinguish it from unhopped ale in places like England, was gradual. It faced resistance on several fronts. Some people genuinely preferred the familiar taste of their traditional Groot ales. The bitterness of hops could be an acquired taste. More significantly, powerful economic interests stood in the way. Those Grootrecht holders, the churches, nobles, or towns that profited handsomely from controlling the Groot supply, were understandably reluctant to see their income stream dry up as brewers turned to this new, freely available at first botanical. Tradition and innate conservatism also played their part. Change often comes slowly. Imagine the first local brewer who decided to go all in with hops. Well, this is certainly invigorating. His patrons might have said, their faces puckering. I can no longer feel my teeth. But by St. George, I wager this brew will still be drinkable come Michaelmas. Perhaps even Martinmas. Despite the resistance, the advantages of hops were too compelling to ignore. The extended shelf life revolutionized the brewing industry. Beer could now become a more reliable article of commerce, traded between towns and even countries. It could be provisioned for long sea voyages, fueling exploration and trade. The consistency of hopped beer was also a major draw. While Groot recipes could be variable and their effects unpredictable, hops offered a more standardized bittering and preservative quality. This shift inevitably led to economic changes, the slow decline of Groot monopolies, the rise of hop farming as a specialized agricultural sector, and the increasing viability of larger-scale brewing operations that could benefit from the improved stability of their product. England, for instance, was relatively late to the hop party, with hopped beer being imported from the Low Countries for some time before English brewers fully embraced hop cultivation and use, often amidst suspicion and even temporary bans on this pernicious weed. However, by the 15th and 16th centuries, hopped beer was becoming increasingly dominant across much of Europe. A major historical fact highlighting this shift is the advent of laws like the Bavarian Reinheitsgebot of 1516. While initially a local ordinance focused on stipulating only barley, water, and hops yeast being added later, once its role was understood for beer production, it underscored the central role hops had achieved in German brewing and influenced brewing purity ideals for centuries. Suddenly, everyone seemed to want that clean bitterness and the newfound ability to store a barrel for more than a fortnight without it staging a hostile microbial takeover. Progress. For a quirky tidbit, early opponents of hops didn't just dislike the taste, they sometimes made rather outlandish claims about its supposed ill effects. Hops were accused of causing melancholy, drying up the blood, or being generally detrimental to health. Conversely, enthusiastic early adopters might have exaggerated their benefits, perhaps viewing them as a panacea for all brewing ills. The ultimate triumph of hops over Groot remains a fascinating topic. Historians still argue about the primary driver. Was it undeniably the superior preservative quality that allowed for a more stable and tradable product? Was it a genuine shift in consumer taste towards a cleaner, more bitter flavor profile? Or were economic factors, such as the desire to break the Groot monopolies and facilitate larger, more centralized brewing operations, the most significant catalyst? It was most likely a complex interplay of all these factors, seasoned with cultural preferences and perhaps even subtle political currents. And so, our journey through the mists of medieval brewing, from the rustic brewhouse with its questionable sanitation and desperate grains, through the mysteries of Groot and the piety of monastic cellars, past the hard-working alewives and the raucous joy of festival ales, now arrives at this pivotal moment of change. The small, unassuming hop cone, initially perhaps just another curious botanical, slowly but surely resculpted the landscape of ale and beer, paving the way for the incredible diversity of brews we know today. The medieval world, with its strange and often forgotten techniques, its reliance on intuition and raw ingredients, laid the groundwork, barrel by sticky barrel, as the fire in our imaginary medieval brewhouse dwindles to glowing embers, and the sounds of the tavern fade into a gentle murmur. It's time to let these ancient figures and their curious concoctions drift into the soft focus of your dreams. You've walked the muddy track to the village well, felt the rough texture of hand-milled malt, inhaled the complex perfume of Groot herbs, and perhaps even dodged a flying hot rock or two. You've seen the dedication of the monk, the resilience of the alewife, and the sheer, hopeful gamble of every fermentation. The world of forgotten medieval brewing was one of constant adaptation, of making do with what was at hand, of battling the elements and the invisible forces of spoilage, all in pursuit of that essential, life-sustaining, and often joy-giving pint. The echoes of their efforts, their challenges, and their rudimentary triumphs can still be found, if you know where to look, in the traditions and tastes that have filtered down through the centuries. So, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll find yourself in a dimly lit alehouse, a friendly face offering you a tankard of something brewed with forgotten herbs and ancient wisdom. Don't worry too much about what's in it. Just enjoy the story. End of script. Sweet dreams.